I am Catherine Snow, and it is my great pleasure to be here. Well, it is my mitigated pleasure to be here. As we were discussing, for some of you who are new to ProLier, this is a traditionally small face-to-face gathering of people in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which has adapted and expanded and exploited the possibility of face-to-face gatherings to develop a much broader and enriched worldwide community. So we welcome you all and hope that in the future, whatever happens, somehow these connections will be maintained. I have often addressed the face-to-face gatherings of ProLier, and when Renata was putting together the program for this year, she suggested that I again address the group and that I again talk about this question of early literacy instruction. And I protested that there is really nothing new to say about this topic, that we absolutely we know the story, and she and various of her colleagues said, well, no, but there are people who need to know the story, so who haven't heard it yet. And I suppose just because I've been giving this talk for 25 years doesn't mean that everybody, it certainly doesn't mean that everybody has been convinced. That I fully. So I will go ahead and hope that you are now seeing my screen. Yes, are you? Okay.
Yes, we are.
And talk about some general ways of thinking about early literacy development and instruction, and in particular, thinking about what we do, what resources we have available, what we really have to do to ensure success for all children, and what we shouldn't do, what counteracts success. And I again want to thank Silvia Romero Contreras and Ivana Corrado for having thought with me about this talk and provided resources that you will see toward the end, in the second half of the talk. So let me just lay out a couple of basic principles here. First of all, I'm going to be talking mostly about the primary grades, the first couple of years of school, depending on your educational system, maybe kinder through second grade or maybe pre-K through third grade. But that absolute wonderful success in those years does not ensure success later on. So we do have to think about literacy development as a long-term process. And recognize that the abilities predicting success as a second grader are different from the abilities that predict success as an eighth grader or a high school student. Those abilities, that means that the early grades teachers have a huge responsibility, because they have to prepare kids to succeed at, let's say, the end of second grade. But at the same time, if they're doing a really good job, they have to prepare kids to succeed at the end of 12th grade as well, because some of the basis, some of the foundation is laid in those early years. But the basic claim here is that there are very specific tasks for K-2, which include accomplishing adequate control over phonological awareness, letter sound correspondence, automaticity in making that link from letters to sounds, and vice versa. And then there are some abilities that predict later success, and those are much bigger, broader, more complicated. They're language and knowledge and thinking and critical reasoning and perspective taking, and those can start in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, but of course they continue to develop throughout life. The focus of this talk is early reading, and we actually know a lot about how to achieve universal success in early reading. There are really no excuses for failure, for widespread or societal failure there. I mean, there might be individual kids whom we can't, with whom we can't succeed for various reasons, but not on a broad scale. And we're less successful in supporting universal success in later literacy development. And I'm not going to talk about that so much, but just point out that we can't ignore it either. So the early literacy policy and practice challenge is, I think, achieving the right mix of these short-term and the long-term goals in the early years classroom. And maybe the policy challenge is figuring out how to communicate to our friends and colleagues in positions of influence what that right mix is, that it is a mix, that it isn't a single solution. And what I'm going to speak sort of from my history in North America, with the history of the reading wars in North America, with which I have tried hard to avoid, and into which I have gotten embroiled. When I was first at the Harvard Graduate School of Education as a visiting scholar on sabbatical in 1978, my office was next door to that of Jean Chall, the grande dame of reading in North America at the time. And Jean was a slightly combative, no nonsense lady. Slightly combative, perhaps because she was only about 4 feet tall, and I suppose she had to do a lot to get her voice heard in the world. And I would hear her on the phone yelling and screaming at people, her colleagues and opponents in this reading field. And I thought to myself, I remember saying to myself, at the time I was kind of a semi-legitimate child language researcher. I said to myself, boy, this reading field is vicious. I'm never doing anything related to that. So, which actually is how I got embroiled in it, because by virtue of never doing anything related to it, I was one of the few people who was kind of untouched by the controversies when a neutral voice was needed. But basically, this has been a pendulum which has swung way too far back and forth from one side of code focus to the other side of language focus, to code focus to language focus over the history of American reading instruction. And I guess you're experiencing the same thing in Latin America. As a result of that reading, the complexities of those reading wars, the American National Academy of Sciences in 1995 decided that there was now enough compelling research that they could oversee a report that would solve the question, what is the right mix of early reading? What do we know about early reading? What's the definitive statement? And I was asked to chair that committee because everybody else in the field of reading, everybody in the field of reading, everybody who knew anything about reading was well identified on one side or the other of the controversy, and therefore was not credible as a committee chair. And the report, which we wrote over the course of 3 years of many arguments and productive and unproductive discussions, ended up making 3 not very controversial recommendations. I mean, it was more complicated in the book, but basically it boiled down to this, that if you're going to prevent reading difficulties, if you're going to create societal conditions in which all kids have a chance to be good readers by the end of grade 3, remember this is in English, takes longer in English, by the end of grade 3, then everybody needs, all children need the opportunity to grasp and master the alphabetic principle, simultaneously the opportunity to develop broad and deep language skills, and the opportunity to develop positive feelings about literacy, the motivation to be literate. This was the beginning for me of my being plunged into the reading wars. We wrote that report and it was published in 1998. And made those 3 big recommendations. And immediately the pendulum swung back to the other side because people thought, oh, there is not much in there about explicit phonics instruction. We better write a complementary or maybe even supplanting report. So this notion that there was not enough emphasis on the code in our report was first of all a misrepresentation. There was a fair amount of emphasis on the code. We said master, grasp and master the alphabetic principle. And grasping the alphabetic principle, what does that imply? That implies that kids have to get the idea that letters and represent sounds, that phonemes are represented by graphemes. And we recognize that we did not recommend every child needs 2 years of phonics instruction. We recommended that all children be given sufficient support to grasp that principle. And you know, there are kids, I don't know if you've encountered any of them. I have encountered a couple. They're kind of scary. They come down to the breakfast table one day at the age of 4 and pick up the newspaper and say, oh, gee, Dad, what does budget negotiations mean, right? Because they've somehow figured out how to read on their own. That's very rare, but it does happen. For most kids, it's not like that. They need someone to explain to them. Letters, those are letters. They're different, they're sounds. They represent sounds. Let's do some practice on how letters and how they represent different sounds. I remember when my granddaughter was 3, self-indulgent anecdote, and she was just learning to reliably recognize letters. And we were taking her out for an excursion in the car, and she looked at a Dunkin' Donuts sign and said, D. And I said, yeah, D, that says Dunkin' Donuts. What would it say if it were an F? And she looked at me peculiarly, and I said, it would say Funkin' Phonuts. And she thought that was the funniest thing she'd ever heard, and then said, oh, what a B? So Bunkin' Bonuts. And we went through the alphabet, right? Now that was phonological awareness training in an informal way that was made possible because she had letter recognition skills already. But and I think that sort of experience is crucial, and it's one of the kinds of experiences that some kids have at home and other kids don't have unless they get it at school. It's the kind of thing that we have to build into the instructional program. But we did not make explicit guidelines like that in preventing reading difficulties in young children, because we said, well, grasp means that all kids need to, formative assessments will tell you whether they've grasped it. And then they need experiences enabling them to master this principle. What does that mean? It means they need to read a lot of stuff that they can read, a lot of sort of relatively easy texts, so that they practice again and again and again these skills that they have now kind of mastered the basic control over. Now, that set of recommendations was not seen by a certain group of people as sufficiently emphasizing the code. And so they said, okay, we're going to do another report, and we're going to just look at experimental and quasi-experimental studies, not at developmental studies or longitudinal studies. And they came out with this very useful report, the National Reading Panel report, which did a much more targeted analysis of the literature, and then basically sent the message, we need more emphasis on the code, we need more phonics, we need more phonological awareness. Not a bad message, but bad in its consequences because it then triggered a backlash. It was so extreme that it triggered a backlash. And the backlash triggered another backlash. And in fact, we're in the middle of a backlash on the code emphasis side right here in the US, the science of reading, which has become the new shorthand for teach the code. So this back and forth of the pendulum is, I would argue, a very, very bad thing. I think it just does not help improve teachers thinking about what they want to do. I think it doesn't help kids. I think it's the kind of thing that causes policymakers to say, I'm not even going to, provide support for early literacy programs because those folks don't know what they're doing. So our recommendations about grasping and mastering the alphabetic principle, I think, are still a good basic set of guidelines. At the same time, we said early literacy instruction needs to attend to motivation about literacy, positive feelings. Kids need to enjoy it. Why do they need to enjoy it? Well, because there is this distinction between grasping these principles, that letters, that graphemes represent phonemes, and mastering that principle. And mastering the principle for some kids means a lot of work. It means sort of reading a lot of texts, getting it down solid, getting to the point where it's not a struggle figuring out every word, but where it's an automatic procedure, a relatively fluent procedure. And so motivation and positive feelings about literacy are really important in this early stage for some kids. And most kids struggle later on with some aspect of comprehension. If they have a deep well of positive motivation to call on, I think they're probably better off at that stage too. But then at the same time, kids need the opportunity to develop broad and deep language skills, because ultimately, when they've mastered the alphabetic principle, they're going to apply it to language. And the language has to be comprehended. And that's basically a language task, slightly complicated by the presence of print. So, and that's the view that is in fact kind of encapsulated in this very influential elderly view of reading comprehension, introduced in 1986 by Goff and Tunmer, which they called the simple view of reading. And in 1986, this was a remarkably kind of clarifying conceptualization for the reading field. And it was this very basic claim that comprehension is a product of decoding times oral comprehension. So reading comprehension is decoding plus oral comprehension. And what a lot of this has been widely replicated. I think it's still true, at least for comprehension at grade 3 or grade 4, maybe not for later comprehension, which is much more complicated. But the instructional implications of this were interesting, because people could seize on both halves of the equation and say, oh, okay, so we need more vocabulary. That's what's going to promote oral comprehension. Oh no, we need more decoding. That's what's going to promote reading comprehension. And the problem is, there's no reason you can't teach both. Ideally, in the context of motivating tasks, and in the context of authentic tasks that enable the integration of the decoding with the oral language. So if we put it all together, then the implications of preventing reading difficulties were a three-way integration, an integration of these three basic opportunities to learn. And that means allocating time appropriately, right? Because we just want kids to grasp and master the alphabetic principle. We don't want them to spend any more time on it than absolutely necessary, right? It's sort of because there's a lot to be done in the domain of broad and deep language skills that needs a lot of instructional attention. Teaching content through literacy and oral discussion in order to expand these capacities, the language capacities, and to build the background knowledge that's going to be needed for comprehension. Ensure kids understand the alphabetic principle so they can achieve mastery, automaticity through reading widely about topics of interest to them to build the motivation. It should be simple, right? We know how to do that. We should know how to do that. Okay, so here's another representation of this complex sort of system developed by Hollis Scarborough, who was a member of the committee on preventing reading difficulties in young children. And you know, when you're chairing a committee meeting and people are sitting around a conference table doodling, and you think to yourself, oh, damn, I really wish they'd be more involved in the discussion. Well, Hollis was actually doodling this. She was synthesizing in the discussion with this very, I think, iconic, now very familiar little sketch of the ways in which word recognition skills and language comprehension skills, you could say this is the simple view, get developed into a single system that is skilled reading, that is real reading comprehension, but that there's a somewhat different developmental trajectory, that word recognition skills have to get made automatic, right? Whereas language comprehension skills start out kind of automatic, but they have to become increasingly strategic if they're going to be useful for reading comprehension. So it's just another little mnemonic for how these different systems fit together. And so what I've done is taken more or less this list of the things that have to be put together, the skills that kids need, and put it into a kind of a diagnostic table, not with the idea that it would be one tool for reviewing different approaches to teaching reading, to initial literacy instruction. Just not as a judgment on them, but as guidance about what they do a good job of and what needs filled in. Oh, so I see Pelusa actually has a piece of rope to observe that it's all fitting everything together that makes the rope strong. Yes, exactly right. If you only have one of these strands, you're definitely not doing a very good job of holding things together at the end. So take this for what it's worth. It was just a way that I thought of to kind of compare, simplify, identify strengths in different programs. And I don't really expect you to be able to read this, but one of the people who was very involved in I take that back, in pointing out deficits in the conclusions from preventing reading difficulties was Louisa Moats, who was very kind of critical about the fact that we didn't emphasize phonics instruction sufficiently. Louisa subsequently, and she's very smart in her analysis of particularly the challenges of word reading and spelling in English. She's learned a lot about that. And she developed subsequently a initial reading instructional program that's very focused on the code and the complexities of the code in English. And it's got an explicit sequence. It's got instructions to teach about all the different syllable types and their in English, of which there are a few hundred, and the implications for spelling and pronunciation. And it's extremely scholarly, and it's very constricting if you apply it in a first grade classroom. She also argues that in order to make sure that kids understand each phoneme correctly, that you should teach you shouldn't just display it, that's an M, that you should talk about the articulatory gestures associated with each of those phonemes and so forth. So this is just the first piece of her program. But if you put it onto this little metric, you could see clearly that it does a great job of teaching phonological awareness, letter recognition, letter sound correspondences, and automaticity with familiar letter sequences, because she emphasizes these frequent letter sequences. But there is, so far in this program, that it's only the beginning of it, it's only one piece of it, any attention to the language part of the rope, okay? Now, another widely disseminated US approach to early reading was Lucy Culkin's Reader and Writer's Workshop, which had this schema for what you should do in a day's literacy workshop. And if you look at this, you will realize that it's all how the teacher and student activities are structured, and there is nothing about the content. And in any case, it's not really the details of this that are so impactful. It's as the fact that there's nothing in here about what you teach, actually. It's sort of, you do 10 minutes of this and 20 minutes of that, but the content is kind of missing, because it was a pedagogical approach, but then it was adopted as a literacy program. She got, starting about 5 years ago, she started getting a lot of critique about that, and about the fact that this Reader and Writer's Workshop, which had been adopted in many schools and which has some really good features to it. The good features are that there's a lot of independent reading and writing. Here you see independent reading and writing and conferring and small group work. So there's a lot of chances for kids to work at things that teachers aren't telling them, that they aren't being talked at. But the quality of what's going on is very much dependent on the individual teacher, not the guidance from the framework. But so Lucy Calkins was getting a lot of pushback from the science of reading people. So she has now released a supplement that is more code-based. And it's very interesting to read her guidelines for how to use this material, which is not very structured. It's not very sequential. It's kind of the exact opposite of the Moats approach. But as you can see, it's sort of pretty and engaging and fun. And her guidelines to teachers are, you should teach phonics, but never more than 20 minutes a day. Never more than 20 minutes a day, which is actually, I think, a perfectly reasonable guideline. Some kids might need 3 months of 20 minutes a day. Some might need 3 weeks of 20 minutes a day. The key thing is you have to know where the kids are so you know when to stop. Because there's no point in teaching this stuff after the kids have grasped it. Then they should be going on to mastering it rather than grasping it. So if we put the Readers and Writers Workshop on this grid, then we can see that now there's some support for letter recognition and letter sound correspondence. And there's a lot of support for text structures and literacy conventions. But it's very unclear to what extent they do any phonological awareness and whether they do enough focus on reading for mastery, although they do a lot of writing for mastery. And once again, this is just, I don't have complete access to any of these programs because you'd have to buy them to get complete access. So I'm sort of taking a first cut at this based on what's available in the literature. But, and I'm not saying this is a final judgment. What I'm suggesting is that this is a way of looking at these programs and seeing where they have strengths. Switching to South America, here is an initial literacy program that has been used in the state of Sao Paulo, which is a wonderfully rich resource for language, for read-alouds, It's got a lot of language in it. As you can see, this is not language that a first grader who hasn't actually learned how to read is likely to be able to access. It's got these great stories and parlendas, which are a lot of fun. But there is no attention in this program to actually teaching kids letter sound correspondence that would enable them to access these texts without mediation. So if we kind of looked at this one on this grid, then phonological awareness, letter recognition, letter sound correspondence, automaticity, not there. But a lot of exposure to rich sentence structures, text structures, and literacy conventions, lots of different genres. And again, I'm not, for what it is, it's probably quite good. The question is, what's it being used for, and how is it supplemented? And I think that's one big topic here. How do you put these things together? A lot of American schools, for example, are using sort of a Readers and Writers Workshop or other whole languagey programs because they like the content and the fun of them. But then they add on a very code-based program on top. The most frequently used one in the US is a program called Fundations, which is strictly scripted and sequential, and well, what can I say? One of the schools that I've had contact with, the kids started referring to it as dations rather than fundations because they said it's no fun. But it does seem to be effective in in structuring exposure to the basic code. So a postdoctoral student funded by the Lemon Foundation, working with me, named Renan Sargiani, developed a program called Novos Amigos that he thought of as kind of a supplement, sort of filling out the holes in the typical approach to early literacy in Brazil, in the state of São Paulo. And it was it's very structured, and it's very simple. And there's a trick, like a snake. And this is the Louisa procedure, trick given for the articulatory, repeat it, fill it into words. So each of the lessons has exactly the same structure. And so that means that it's easy for teachers to use it, and you don't need a lot of professional development. But the idea is that this would not be a complete program all by itself. It's good up here on this stuff, and it does a little bit of word meaning, but it doesn't get into the language richness. Oh, did the presentation stop too, Paul?
Yes, yes, we are not seeing this presentation.
Do you want me to share my screen, Catherine?
No.
Oh, okay.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, it's
Yes.
perfect. We actually lost you for like 3 minutes, Catherine.
You're kidding. Oh,
Yeah,
No,
I don't.
went out and came back. It's just internet. You showed us that in Latin America, that's normal. If it can happen in Cambridge, it can happen in Latin America. So that's great.
Yeah,
yeah,
it sure can. So anyway, this is the program. You can find out more about it from Renan Sargiani. But it has some really nice affordances. But again, it's not a complete program, right? It could work well as a supplement, as a complement to a program that was more language focused. So moving to Argentina and to folks in the room, yo aprendo a leer y escribir. This is a program that's supplementary, explicitly supplementary, and this is just the first little piece of it. And again, it's very striking that it's extremely elaborated on helping kids and tutors or parents or teachers or whoever know how to introduce letters and sounds. It's got all, for each letter or little letter sequence, it's got 20 to 21 different activities to really develop the automaticity with recognizing and writing the letter and sound. But again, it's meant as a partial program. I mean, there's more to it afterwards, but this initial piece does not initially address issues of comprehension or sort of extended texts. And that, again, it's not a critique, it's guidance. It's a way of thinking about what programs do a good job of and what other programs or later elements in these programs need to address. And then we come to Queremos Aprender, and I'm not going to really talk about this very much. I will maybe invite Ana Maria Borzone or anybody else of the large team associated with developing this program to talk about it. But this is meant to be a full year, a full school year, or 2 school years, maybe even, and to cover all cognitive and socio-emotional as well as literacy. It's got a lot of very rich features in it. One, so you can sort of map this onto the Hollis-Scarborough rope and think about what's covered. Certainly a lot of language, a lot of letters and sounds, phonological awareness, echo reading or choral reading for automaticity, and thinking deeply, reflecting on what's been read, metacognition, and oral language, like telling anecdotes and stories to one another. Here's an initial phonological awareness activity. I did note, and I'm going to ask Ivana or Ana Maria or somebody else to correct me if I'm wrong about this. I find that there's a lot of focus on initial sounds and not much focus on those same sounds in later word positions. And yet it is very important to recognize, not so much for because it's sort of always the same, but other letters have slightly different phonetic features in different word positions. And it's important to point out that the b in ball and the b in rabbit and the b in rub, which are actually quite different from one another, are all the same phoneme, if kids are getting confused about that. But the more advanced and comprehensive phonological awareness that I see in this program is the use of invented spelling in writing, which is, invented spelling is itself a great source of access to phonological awareness. It's a nicely articulated program from kindergarten to 1st grade. It's been very well thought through with lots of activities, workbooks for kids and professional development. And obviously I'm just basically hitting some highlights here. There'd be much more to say about this, but one of the things I think is very valuable about it is that it also directly addresses world knowledge as part of the reading materials, as well as SEL skills. My students from Harvard know that I care more about world knowledge than about SEL. But it's all good stuff. It's all important to worry about. And here again, world knowledge conveyed in relatively brief and accessible texts that kids have learned enough of the code that they could access these texts. They could actually read them and learn from them. And lots of oral language stuff, including a notice here of bilingualism of the Mapuche language and culture, which is certainly a good aspect of SEL as well as world knowledge. and a lot of opportunities for kids to talk about their own experiences. This program, I think, hits more of the, clearly hits more of these elements, and probably literacy conventions, literary conventions are in there too. And probably, as Ana Maria, as you say, because Spanish is so much more transparent, it might need less focus on repeated reading for automaticity than in English, where there are so many minor spelling rules that really need, kids need a lot of exposure to spelling rules like IGHT or, you know, that forms like that don't come up very often, but that you have to be able to read automatically if you're going to read effectively. So the
Yes,
differences.
I'm sorry. We have always little books for practice. you are maybe you have not all the material.
No, I
of the
don't have any of the
program.
materials.
No, we have and video games to learn and to practice reading and writing.
Okay,
That-
I'm changing that.
yes, the books Klofki 1 and Klofki 2 try teach comprehension and production strategies and the code and also the code, but we have another material to practice and the learning of the code.
Fantastic. And again, as I say, it's clearly all kids need practice to get better and faster, but I do think there are particular constraints on that in English because of the depth of the orthography and the need to make sure kids see those minor words that represent those minor spelling rules more frequently. So, okay, but the point is that these are different programs, they have different affordances, and many schools are going to end up with programs that do not cover all of those bases. And sort of what can they do and how can they, I mean, obviously the ideal thing is if every school, every teacher selects one good complete program like Queremos Aprender, but many are required to take the default option of, you know, picking the one that's required, that's been mandated, and supplementing it. Or maybe they're lucky enough to be able to develop their own new comprehensive program. I think the worry I have in general is that this general risk in education, particularly in a situation like this, where the pendulum is swinging back and forth and people are sort of arguing, oh no, we do have enough code. Oh no, we do have enough language. Oh, you know, we do, right? That these capacities, which are meant to be tools, reading words is not an end in itself. It's a tool toward the end of comprehension. Spelling correctly is not an end in itself. It's a tool toward rapid and efficient reading. That if we turn those tools into targets and forget to link them back to the target, the ultimate, the larger authentic task, that's potentially dangerous. But all of these options basically require some knowledge of what's needed and how to implement it. And so the next question is, who in the system has that knowledge? Where do we turn? Or do teachers have that knowledge? Do school administrators have that knowledge? Do policymakers have that knowledge? And fortunately, in answering that question, Silvia Romero undertook a questionnaire, and I'm actually going to let her talk about this. I'll just do the boring stuff and let her talk about the interesting stuff. She has collected so far with her colleagues 55 responses from teachers mostly in Argentina, Costa Rica, and Ecuador. who work about half in private schools and half in public schools. In classes that were surprisingly small to me, I've seen a lot larger classes than this in schools I've visited in Latin America, and not exclusively needy children, because of course there's a lot of private schooling represented here, but quite many years of experience on average and pretty well prepared. And there was a question of what literacy experts have you consulted? And I found these responses amusing. I mean, I don't know who all of these people are, actually. I do know who Vygotsky, Montessori, and Piaget are. And I know they're not literacy experts. They are wonderful developmental psychologists, but they do not focus on literacy. On the other hand, most of these respondents reported having received some specific training in literacy, and their responses about method split basically half and half. Those who responded constructivist, global, constructivist, communicative versus alphabetic, syllabic, phonological awareness, phonemes, graphemes. So there's clearly the same conversation is clearly going on among these teachers as is going on in North America. So Sylvia, do you want to tell us about this?
Hi, sure, Catherine. I hope my dog doesn't bother us too much. There he is. Well, this is a survey that we developed, Gabriela Silva, who is in the audience, and myself, and we try to figure out how teachers are understanding the needs of students to learn how to read and write in Spanish. And we kind of gather a series of options that we've observed teachers using and see how this was working with our teachers in Mexico. And then we send it to people in Chile and in Argentina and Costa Rica, and we got a few responses. So this is an ongoing research that we would like you, if you want to contribute, we just have put the link on the chat. So as you can see here, a lot of teachers are doing what we can identify as the question is, what of the following topics you're teaching your students on a regular basis? And so what we see is that at least in Latin America, they are doing very little of phonological awareness. They are not really working on the alphabetic principle in terms of phonological awareness. What they're doing is a lot of guessing and a lot of comprehension. If we think that this was answered by teachers in elementary and preschool, what we see is that they are working a lot on content, on whole language kind of strategies, which is not bad, but I think we do need a lot more work in phonological awareness and letter word correspondence, which are the bottom strategies down here. And one of the things I was telling Catherine when we were preparing this talk is that if we look through the books in Mexico, for example, the official books, if you're not familiar with it, in Mexico, we do have an official book that is used by every single teacher. And we do not have the term phonological awareness on the textbook at all, or on the teacher manuals at all. So that means that there is not this understanding of how to go from oral language to written language through phonological awareness and the kind of games that Catherine was talking about with her little, with her granddaughter. So that's one of the important or the big messages that we got through this survey. And we have a few more slides.
Yeah. So the title of this talk is what we know, what we should do, what we shouldn't do. And just to point out, these are two things we shouldn't do, right? These are really bad. Everything else here is fine, right? is good in its place in a balanced integrated program. But sort of looking at the picture to guess the word, not helpful for anybody. Or global recognition of words, again, not a good idea. So it's kind of amazing that 60% of respondents agreed that that was something they included in their teaching. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Sylvia.
Yes, and then we also asked the teachers how, what activities they were implementing in the classroom. And again, we see that even though not many teachers or not all the teachers are doing like a kind of the traditional, really boring stuff, they're still kind of there because they're doing a lot of dictation, and that we see a lot in the classrooms. And they're doing, but the good thing is that they're using mobile alphabets or things like that to work with the kids. But then, and we see less and less of copying and doing, you know, like more mechanical work. But still, there's this variety. For example, the exercise of drawing or having all these exercises, motor skills is also very popular. So still, there are a lot of, we don't know how they are combining this, which is another kind of big question we should have. I mean, none of these are really not useful at all, unless, but as Catherine said, there are a few that shouldn't be done. But still, the combination and how long teachers work on each of these skills can make a huge difference as well. So that's one of the things we couldn't ask in the survey.
Oh, sorry.
And then we also asked them how they work with comprehension. And here, again, we do have a lot of prediction. We do have a lot of previous knowledge. And one of the strategies I find that are not really useful, people are using them a lot, teachers are using them a lot. Asking the kids to write a different ending, for example. It's like I mean, I wonder why they're doing that, but okay, they're using it a lot. And what they're using less is asking them to write a summary, for example, of the text, which in terms of informative text would be very useful. Again, we do not know how they are combining all these strategies, but it gives us an idea of what they're doing in terms of comprehension. And one of the areas that we were interested about, because we are working with the Word Jam program that Catherine has developed, and that is based on oral language and debate and academic vocabulary, was how often teachers would promote students to, you know, talk about their opinions and their standpoint on a specific matter. So we did make a few questions just to kind of search a little bit in this direction. And we were very surprised. Well, not really, because we've seen it in the classrooms, but it is interesting to see that even though the teachers do ask for students' opinion and promote oral, you know, oral discussions, when we ask them about, for example, teaching the structure of argumentative text, we see very little there. Or teaching and practice specific phrases to make students, to help students express their opinion, we also see very few teachers doing that. Or asking students to write their position on a specific topic, it's also very rare. So what I have observed and what we see here again is that in many cases, some of the important aspects of reading or writing or decoding are taught, quote unquote, not explicitly. It's like having kids do things and then have them think how they did it by themselves. So exposure is sometimes or often mixed with or confused with teaching. And this is I think this is very clearly shown here. Teachers do have students express themselves and talk about their opinions, but they are not really teaching them how to do it.
And yeah, okay. So let me say, I mean, these were mostly early grades teachers, and you might think, well, this is not appropriate for the early grades, but we've found that it's actually one of the things that promoting debates or discussions in the early grades does is it shifts those, it shifts the focus off tools and puts it onto targets. Like, why do you have to learn these words? Well, because we need them for making a good argument. Or why do I have to, how do you practice reading? Well, you can practice reading with little stories, but you can also practice reading to accumulate evidence in support of your position. So I think this is an interesting thing to integrate into the rest of the rest of the array of opportunities. So thank you, Sylvia. And I just want to end by saying that the other piece of all of this is that there's a whole hell of a lot of stuff to do, a lot of different targets of teaching, a lot of tools that kids need to acquire, but we need to think in the early grades, not just about the short-term goals that are solved by teaching letters and sounds and spelling rules and rapid word and accurate word reading, but also about the much larger space that is represented by background knowledge and the richness of the larger language system. And the first grade, second grade teacher has to do all of that, whereas later grade teachers can presuppose that this piece of the system is in place and really focus then on background knowledge and language. So here are my little simple takeaways. What do we do, at least in North America? Curricula get selected for reasons that often rely on outdated theories or rely on sort of a religious affiliation with one pole or the other of this unnecessary controversy, without collecting the data and the systematic data that would enable schools to make decisions about what works for their students. I think what we have to do is recognize the complexity of the reading process, so we attend to all the things that kids need to learn in the right order and with the right allocation of time to those various different targets of teaching. But what we mustn't do is allow the pendulum to swing too far, either toward constructivist approaches or toward positivist approaches, which is what happens when we allow disagreements over methods. Should you do more of this? Should you do less of that? When we allow that to become attacks on individuals, which often has happened in my experience in the US. And when we sort of nurture a commitment to an approach that is so strong that it blocks continuous collection of data about the effectiveness of that approach, because there is no perfect curriculum out there. Every curriculum could be made better with data that would inform the designers and the teachers about how to use it, how to fix it, how to use it better. And that should be what we're involved in, I think, in an educational process, a process of continuous quality improvement rather than resting on our laurels